Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Cherwell Advanced Practitioner call today. Our host today is Kim Euchre, who is one of our senior Cherwell consultants on staff. I'll give a very brief overview of our company in case this is your first time joining us and you don't know who Stratacom is, and then we'll dig right into our content. Stratacom was founded in 1997. We focus primarily on IT service management consulting. We've worked with a variety of products over the years as they've come and gone in the marketplace, and currently Cherwell is the majority of what we focus on this day and age. A couple housekeeping items. This is being recorded, so we're going to be happy to share the recorded links with you. It takes several business days for us to get the video converted and loaded onto our website, but when that is available, you will receive the recordings. You can view this or share with your team. If you'd like the slide deck, you're also welcome to email me. My contact information I'll show at the end, and I'm happy to share the slide deck with you. If you have any questions, everyone will be on mute throughout the webinar until Kim is done with her training topic, but I'm happy to interrupt her with questions. There's a questions panel or a chat panel that you're welcome to use. If you would use questions, that'll help me keep track. If you don't see it, you should see an orange box with a white arrow. If you click that, it'll expand your panels. You should see the place where to answer questions. Once our training topic's done, we will have the line open for any and all questions you may have for Kim. If there's a specific challenge you've been having lately, questions you have about versions coming up, we'll leave the line open for any and all questions, whether or not they actually relate to our training topic today. So feel free to stick around for that as well. With that, I would like to kick it off to Kim to get started and dig into our topic today, which is maps versus blueprints. Kim, it's all yours.
Thank you. And as Laura said, if you have any questions along the way, I have a presentation, and then we can get into any comments or questions. But please interrupt, and I will be happy to answer anything that I can along the way. So what are these things anyway? Well, a map is a mergeable application. It was something that was developed by Cherwell in order to be able to merge unlike items into a system. So if you have a new piece of new third-party application that you're developing, and you don't want to overwrite your customer's business object, it allows you to bring some of those items in, some of those fields and those other functionality without disturbing all of their pieces as well. And so, like I said, it allows the individual fields to be merged. It also allows for an application, a third-party application, to be distributable. So, for example, we have our RED, which is Requirements, Enhancements, and Defects map. And that allows us to distribute that map to our customers and to whoever wants it. It's available on the Map Store. It allows for certain decisions to be made when you're importing new and or existing objects. You can get quite creative and specify conditions on certain things. Mostly the maps aren't built quite to that level, but you can. It also allows the companies to fingerprint applications to discourage users from repackaging components into their own maps. And that's something that's very important to note, because if you are working with a fingerprinted application, one that has specified an owner on that map, and you try and put the functionality into another map, you will probably run into issues when you do that, because it'll tell you that it can't do that. Anyway, once you apply a map, that's the first step, the end result of a map is a blueprint that can be applied to that particular target system. And I say some reusability here, and I've got that in quotes, because maps can, depending upon the system, can react a little bit differently sometimes when they're applied. And what I like to do is, first of all, I like to start off with two systems that are going to be the same. If I'm going to be applying the RED map to development and to production, I would like to have a system that is identical between my development and my production system. what I will normally do is I will save off that blueprint that has my modifications in it, and then I will then apply that same blueprint to my production system as well. What I get from that is I know that all of my pieces are going to be the same and that all of my map options have been consumed the same. Because depending upon what items you pick when you're applying a map, you can wind up with incredibly different results. And that's really important to note. So here's just the map wizard when you're actually building a map. You can, once you've started a map, you can add a business object to the map. And first of all, you're asked what kind of importance it has, whether it's a high importance, medium importance, low importance. And then you're kind of like asked to walk through your fields, relationships, forms, form arrangements, approvals, actions. I don't have the actions listed here. And then you're asked whether or not this map should overwrite all fields. And if you pick overwrite all fields, it will act just like a blueprint. It'll overwrite all the fields. If you say don't overwrite any fields, it will not overwrite any of the fields. So it's making an assumption at that point in time that there are no field level changes for this particular business object. And then you say, let me choose. Well, let me choose is a way that you can actually also set it so that it will merge fields. So if I most often when I'm building a map, I almost always select let me choose, and then I will make sure that each one of the fields is set to import if it's not already there. And then that way I know that I'm getting all the pieces in the right place. And so each one of these, like the relationships, the forms, etc., can be set to allow you to overwrite, not overwrite, or conditionally overwrite. And then so on down the line. Most times if I'm bringing in incident into a business object or a map, I almost never will overwrite the form arrangement or the approvals, or even generally the forms. I won't normally overwrite any of the forms as well, unless I know that that form is not going to exist in the incoming system. Adding an object to a map. Also, after you've gone through that wizard and you go into your incident and then your business object properties here, the first screen up at the top, instead of being general, the first tab is a map tab. So here it allows you also to include or not include this item in the map. Remember that importance that we picked on the previous slide. And then you can actually set up some things here as far as merging and importing. Sometimes those items don't give you exactly what you expect. So you have to go through and confirm a lot of those things. And we can walk through that a little bit later. But then for each one of those additional things, like your advanced options, your attachments, and all of these items as well, you notice those weren't in the wizard, but you also have an option to overwrite or not overwrite those as well. And so we're just going to leave maps for the moment, and we're going to go over to a blueprint. So what are a blueprint? The blueprints are a footprint of the Cherwell items and the functionality, and it's a method for implementing the business object functionality in Cherwell. Remember I said that once you get downstream and you've applied a map, you have a blueprint. Well, the blueprint is just like a blueprint of a building. It has what is the footprint and what is the functional design of what we're going to lay down, when we go to build it. And it contains all of their various pieces. It contains the business objects, the one-steps, the expressions, the stored values. It can contain reports, if you have reports, dashboards, any of those items, and you can migrate everything under one umbrella. And then, as I said, all items that get published in Cherwell utilize blueprints to publish. There isn't another way to get functionality that is not in a global folder inside inside Cherwell. And the blueprints allow you access to the protected blueprint folders, which are also only editable when you're working with a blueprint. So here we have adding an object to a blueprint. So if I come into incident, I can actually click here on the add to blueprint, and then that would actually step me through a wizard as far as adding that to a blueprint. Also, and this is a blueprint where I'm coming along after the fact and making a blueprint. Anytime I go into a business object and I were to change the field size or move a field on a form or any of those other functionality, anything that I touch in the system gets marked as being touched, and that will become part of that blueprint. I typically don't save blueprints when I'm in development. I will only build a blueprint at the very end, and we can walk through that, and I can talk about how to find out what has changed in order to how to build a blueprint like that. And so some important things to consider. First off, communication. Both blueprints and maps require communication and coordination between developers. A part of this conversation, by the way, is about whether or not to use maps or blueprints as a migration mechanism. And that's primarily where most of this is coming from, the perspective. And so they are not supposed to be a replacement for that communication and the coordination between developers, because your developers still have to communicate, and you can't work in completely disparate systems and still come together and always expect things to match. Because if I change X and you change X, and when we get to the middle, even though we had a map, we're not that protected that we both changed X. Somebody is going to win in that process, and generally it's going to be the last person who got there. Reusability. Blueprints should generally not be reused, and I say generally because the exception there is when I'm planning to migrate between environments. Most times when I'm working, I have 3 environments. I have a development, a QA or UAT, and a production environment. So what I do before I get ready, I take a copy of my production system and I overlay my QA or UAT system. And so my production and my UAT are identical when I start. I build my blueprint. And then when I'm done with my blueprint, I save off that blueprint. That is the blueprint I use to move to QA. And then all of the things that are being upgraded or added to the environment get tested in the QA environment. If it passes, I take that exact same blueprint and I move that blueprint to production later on. If it doesn't pass, that blueprint will be adjusted and updated, and I will then reapply that to QA. It will get tested. I will then, whenever it passes, I will take that identical blueprint and move that to production. So that's the occasion where I reuse a blueprint, but you can't create a blueprint today on October 1st, make a lot of other changes between October 1st and October 31st, and then go and apply that blueprint on November 1st and expect it to work exactly the same way. Because if something else in the environment has changed, you could run into issues. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't see anything that's come in yet.
Great. So reusability. Maps can be applied to many different environments. And I put this little caution flag there about when you're applying it to multiple environments. Applying a map to 2 different environments could result in different IDs being created, not necessarily, but it could. Subsequent customizations could result in non-matches of the IDs and fail the blueprint publish. There's 2 other things that aren't listed here, is competing elements. If you've existed for a long time in Cherwell, you may have created your own team info, or you may have updated your own team info table. If you were trying to take a map that has a copy of that team info and merge that in, you could theoretically run into issues because the ID for the map version of that table could be different than the ID of the table that you have in your system. And when you try to merge those two together, Cherwell will, even if you've renamed it, Cherwell will then try and like merge that together regardless of, you know, what you've named it. It's a very, very confusing thing, and it's hard to explain unless you've actually been there and done that. Needless to say, you can have issues if you have two functionality that you've created, and now you're bringing in functionality from Cherwell that mirrors, you know, what you've created on your own. And so the other consideration is that the owner of a map, remember I said that components that are owned by third parties that are included in maps should not be included in other maps because it could result in errors if the map is signed. And what that means is that in terms of Red Tracker, if you've deployed Red Tracker and now your company decides that they want to use maps to move everything from development to production, if you try to repackage Red, into your map and move it, you could run into some of those signature errors because of it being a signed application. Compatibility. Maps make every attempt to merge functionality into existing business objects. And here's what I was talking about earlier. As I said, custom created objects may interfere with map objects by the same name. And then not all changes can be merged by a map. Sometimes you might find things that fall out. At the time I was writing this, I had an exact example, and I'm sorry I don't have that example at the moment, but needless to say, not every single thing that you do can be merged by a map. And in terms of the details, know your functionality. You have to know what goes into your map in the first place, as far as the main objects that are in your map. And thinking about all the possible types of endpoints. Who are the targets of my map? What points of collusion might I run into? It might be your production system. So you have a more simplified version of that. But it might be a third party and you're developing that map for anybody to use. Well, then you have to kind of like think outside the box, and you have to think of every different possible iteration of the companies that you might be deploying this to. Are the objects that you're moving your own objects or the existing objects? That's something that's really important. Do you want to overlay forms? And a lot of times if I'm bringing in something and it has anything to do with incident, for example, I will make sure that I choose not to overlay forms unless that company wants an incident refresh and they want the most new forms from Cherwell. I won't generally overlay forms. And then if you do overlay forms, what other functionality might you be interfering or losing by overlaying those forms and the grids? And options, and there's a lot of them, they all matter. Here's a couple of the options that Cherwell offers for some of these things. And this is individually at a field level. This is at a one-step level. If you right-click and you say Map Action, you'll be presented with these options. So make no changes. The map will not migrate this object. It will not be included. So that's a way of excluding something. And import if not found. The map will only include the object if it does not exist when you're applying the blueprint. So if I have my custom field that I'm moving, and it gets to your system and it says, well, my custom field doesn't exist, it'll go ahead and add that. If my custom field does exist, it will not add that to your system. So, and that kind of like protects the destination system as well, so it's not going to overwrite. Now the next option obviously is overwrite. So if I've changed something to be 30 characters from 10, it will change that object to 30 characters. And it will just overwrite everything. It'll overwrite any validations, any calculations, any autofills. It'll overwrite the entire thing. Remove. I could set a map that will remove an object from the target system. And then the last one is reference only. So that means that I am just marking this item so that it gets past some of the scanners and it's included for reference, but again, it will not be moved. Laura, does anybody have any questions?
I don't see any questions for you at this time.
The next one is, there's also about rebasing an object. And this is really important if you are updating a map or updating, maybe like I've made my map and then we went through and did some testing and somewhere along the way, somebody said, well, it would be better if, and there was some new functionality that we did through a blueprint and we made those changes. Well, now the map is out of date. I can rebase an object, and I can actually do this with a blueprint as well, and we can talk about that and maybe walk through that later. But I can actually go in and there's an option to refresh that map object from the published version that's in the system. So maybe I added 10 more fields along the way. I can actually take that version of the business object that has those 10 new fields, rebase it, and now my map will be changed to indicate that I'm using those 10 new fields. And at any time you're going along, you can always go to your file menu and go to map changes, and that will list everything that is included in your map. And you want to always scan before you're publishing the map, and I say scan often. And I can actually go through some examples of that, but scanning can also help you detect in a map things that are missing. A blueprint requires, and both of these work at different ends of the spectrum. A map will tell you things that are missing and probably missing and possibly missing, and so it will go to that end of the spectrum line. A blueprint kind of expects more of what's missing. And so a scanning of a blueprint on a development system isn't going to tell you anything. It's just going to tell you whether or not it's valid in itself. It's not going to tell you, well, maybe these other things need to be included as well. Both are good. And that's really the communication that I want to make here, is that both ends of those are good, and it all comes down to the middle, to that communication element. And so strategies for finding blueprint changes can similarly be used, like I said, to find changes for the maps. And if you are publishing a map for others to use, you want to be careful when incorporating Cherwell business objects. If something is a newer business object, and you might have 2 different versions of it or something like that, or you just want to be careful, cautious. As far as blueprint details, you have to know your functionality. You have to still know what you're moving, whether it's a map or it's a blueprint. And second part is, as I said before, I don't save interim blueprints. And since 9.x, Cherwell saves a copy of every blueprint that you publish in your database. Even if you chose the button that says don't save a blueprint, Cherwell is saving a copy in your database. And so that functionality happens in, I think, version 9.x and above systems. And so what I do is, after the months and months and months of development effort, I go through and I build my final migration blueprint. So I will start a new blueprint from scratch when I'm ready to do this move to my QA and development or production environment. And I will say, I want this incident piece, and I want this configuration piece, and I want this, incident subcategory lookup table, and maybe some data. And I will build exactly what I want to apply. So what the blueprint will not contain is it will not contain all of your oopses. So if I applied something and it didn't work, I've been working on something for the last 2 days and I had a lot of things that didn't work. And if I had had that in a blueprint, I would have had to have applied all those problems. Instead, now I've, completed something and I've gotten all of the things I didn't want removed. And so my final blueprint will not contain all of those oopses. And like I said, only exactly what you want to move will move. And I like to build that final migration blueprint because it's cleaner and it's smaller, and it is a much better way to go, because you know what you're building. You know what's included. Again, just like in the map, if you want to go look at the details, what's in my blueprint? So I can go to the File menu and I can go to Blueprint Details. So now if you're new to that whole object of creating that final blueprint rather than those interim blueprints, how do I know what should be included? Well, I can check the publish log. And the publish log, if you're looking under the blueprint folder, will tell you everything. But if I'm on the incident business object, for example, on my list of options, there is a view publish log right there on the incident business object. So I can go specifically to that, and I can see when the last time my incident business object was updated and more or less what was done to it. I can see, that what kinds of things were touched. It takes a little bit to, get used to reading it, but, you certainly can. So that's one way to definitely see what has changed. When I'm in the publish log, I always keep an idea of when my last major move to production was, like, for example, maybe July 16th. So when I'm building my next blueprint for production, I'm going to review very carefully any changes that were made after July 16th and really determine whether or not I want those to be part of my blueprint, my final blueprint.
Hey, Kim, quick question.
Yes.
Can you recover the published log if you mistakenly deleted it?
If you have a backup of your system, you could always load a backup of your system and reload from the backup. But once you've actually cleared the publish log, I don't think you can go back and clear it. However, that clearing the publish log actually brings up a number of really good points. If I keep my publish log on production, and so I've moved something to production and I'm going to go ahead and publish it, it'll show me all of those things that have changed when I go to production. When I bring that back to development, I could, as part of bringing my system back to development and changing my system variable and everything, I could make that clearing of that log a part of that process. And therefore, remember I said about looking at dates. Well, if I've made that a part of my production to development process, then I don't have to remember. I can just go and look and I can say, oh, well, here's all the things that have changed since the last time I refreshed my environment. And then I don't have to remember dates. So that's important. Go ahead.
Follow-on question, what if you exported it and need to move it back?
I believe there is an import option for that as well. I mean, there is an export. I'm not sure if there's an import or not. If you needed to move it back, you could get kind of creative, and you could put it into another database table, and then you could probably populate across to the database table where that lives. That would require some database expertise and being able to, build the SQL for those kinds of things. But certainly we could determine whether, I think it's in Trebuchet Publish. Trebuchet Publish or Trebuchet Publish Log. And so, you would have to build that manually, but you could probably build the SQL to build that manually.
Okay, I may connect you with this person one-on-one if he has any further questions. So I'm going to make a note of that.
Okay. Now we're back to maps versus blueprints. And if you're not hearing anything during this presentation, the one thing you really need to hear is maps are not a replacement for communication. So just because my company says, well, maps are better because I don't have to know, you still have to know. You still, I mean, it doesn't matter that you all have your own independent working environment. You still are going to have a communication and make sure that two people, like, for example, haven't changed vital parts of incident that are going to be conflicting with one another. And maps, like I said, in my second bullet, maps are not a substitute for keeping disparate systems, multiple sandboxes. That can get kind of confusing and troublesome because certain things, especially if you're changing group objects, will change the entire group. And so if you're making some of those changes, like the specifics or configuration item or customer, and you might have changes, unwanted changes, or conflicting changes that come in from all of those disparate sandboxes. So that is definitely something to consider, and that is probably one of the key places you really have to be careful about. If you are running disparate systems, I recommend having most everything in having a data keeper in the centralized place. And that data keeper would be responsible for adding fields and working with that. And if you needed to distribute out like forms and such to one of the a couple different people, you could then maybe do that on the sandboxes and come back together at the end. But only one person and one system would be responsible at that point for managing those data points, those fields, and those additional things being added. Another thing, as I've mentioned a few times, maps are not a good option for moving customizations of other maps. So for example, if you're trying to include red or our map in your own map, you may run into issues. And just as you can make a whole bunch of options on the building of a map, you can make a whole bunch of options on the application of a map. And the application of a map can wind up with very differing assumptions and very differing results, depending upon which options that you pick. And then, like I said, the maps that you apply multiple times could get applied differently depending on the options. And when I say options, when you go to apply a map, there's 3 options. One that says, make no decisions, tell me about some of the decisions, and then the third one is ask me about every decision. And most times I pick the middle option that says ask me about some of them, but you, like I said, you will get differing results based on those 3 options. Blueprints and part of that comes from knowledge. So if I know I've got a conflict somewhere along the way, that's one of those reasons why I might want to say, ask me about every decision. If it's a very simple map that I have tested, I know and then I might say, ask me no decisions. Maybe it's a data map or something like that. Those are some of the differences in the various options. And blueprints, which are, again, the downstream of a map, they ensure that what you include is what you get. So if I didn't include it in my blueprint, it's not going to get into my production system. And blueprints are always the end result of a map. And I think that blueprints are far more effective at moving data. I've had more issues if I try to move data through a map. So if I'm just moving data, I would generally try to move it through a blueprint rather than, wrapping it in a map that will become a blueprint. So migrating between environments. And the one big thing here is there's no magic solution for migrating. I have to be present in this process in order to get the best product in my QA and or my production system, I have to be present. So communication, communicating between all the different people who might have components of that process, and coming together, finding out and talking about it, and seeing if there's any possible conflicts, and working out those conflicts. And then I say review. You can't review enough. I mean, you know, reviewing the pieces, reviewing all the different endpoints, and then attempting and scanning that blueprint on your QA system. When you scan, it's going to tell you, oh, well, you've missed X. And that might be a point where if it's a map, you go back to your map and build that in, or if it's a blueprint, you go back to your original blueprint and you build that in. And so you can work back and forth that way to come up with a kind of semi-perfect blueprint right off the bat. And the one thing is that neither option offers complete protection. So there is no magic glove. One is not going to allow you to create more problems or prevent other problems from occurring. It really comes down to knowledge and human coordination. And the most important piece is to know your system, to know what you're working with. And here's some things that we found out over time. I mean, you know, more developers equals more complexity. So if I have one developer, I have a single system, I know what I've changed, and I don't have any problems, and I can move all of that. If I have two developers, then there's, you know, two people who have to communicate. So that's easy enough. Let's say I have a super large system, and I have a whole, you know, team of people I've thrown at this process, and I have 10 people working on it. Maybe I have people working at different shifts. The more people you have, the more developers, is going to result in more complexity when it comes to completing and moving your system. The best.
Hey, Kim, we've got a question.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to specify that just certain properties of a field should be updated if it already exists? For example, the size of a field should be changed, but not the autofill?
No. At the field level, you can update the field properties. You can't update. Now, you can update indexes, but not like certain. I can't say some field properties and not other field properties.
Okay.
So, I mean, the person who is, you know, the last to apply that field is the one who's going to win. So, my best option for migrating between environments, I like to have a single development environment. I have developers work on different objects. Sometimes developers have to work on the same object. I mean, for example, sometimes like specifics. There are some ways that, you know, even in a single development environment, that you still can have multiple developers working on a specific, for example, without much chance of interacting with each other and conflicting. And most of that comes down to if you have one person doing some of the database work, and like, let's say I'm building a form for specifics A and you're building a form for specifics B, the chances of us coming together and conflicting with each other aren't as great at that point in time. It really comes down to any time we're adding fields to the database, deleting fields from the database, and even deleting other tables or fields from other things in the system. Because if you don't already know it, Cherwell, the administrator, caches at the time when you log into Cherwell. So when I open the Cherwell administrator, it is going to cache all of those objects for me at that point in time. If someone goes and deletes an object after I have loaded my system and I go to scan, I'm going to probably get an error because it's going to say, well, that object doesn't exist. And there's a real easy fix for that. I can save off my blueprint, and then I can exit out of Cherwell. I can go back into Cherwell, open up that same exact blueprint, and then I can then scan, and I will now be working with the new set of tables that had been cached, because that table that was deleted wasn't changed in my blueprint. I just got affected by that change. And so by saving, exiting, re-entering, you should be able to get past that error. Moving on, an adequate setup environment is multiple developer sandboxes. This requires significant coordination. And also you should have a coordinator that's well-versed in the Cherwell architecture and all the different components. And what is really happening in all of those various different sandboxes. It's almost like an orchestra or conductor, because that conductor has to know what each of those instruments are playing and what piece they're going to be singing or playing along the way. He or she has to know all of those pieces. Communication.
Hey, Kim, we've got another question.
Sure.
Is this a good point to jump in?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. The question is, we are a few weeks away from go live and need to move everything we've built from dev to prod. In our environment, one person builds and maintains the customer-facing forms and such, and the other manages the back-end configuration. We only use the customer and incident objects, but we share the instance with another division that uses many more objects than we do. What would be the best suggested method of moving from development to production?
So you're all, I'm assuming that you're all in a shared Cherwell system. And now you say that the other groups do use incident or they do not use incident?
They also use incident.
They also use incident. And they're making their own changes. Are they using a different view? I know we're waiting on an answer here, Laura. I'm sorry.
I am going to go ahead and unmute this person.
Okay, yep. She says that they have their...
Okay, you're now unmuted to speak with Kim directly.
Hi, Kim.
Hi. Hi.
Okay, so to kind of make this complicated question hopefully a little bit more simple, so we do share the incident business object. However, we have our own kind of section of the business object. So we have our own, we're Komatsu Mining Corporation and the other division is Komatsu America. So we have our KMC incident area and they have their own KAC incident area. And then we have our own separate views that we have built and managed, and we've for the most part tried to keep all of our builds separate from the other divisions' build. But we're wondering how to go about taking all of the information that taking all the stuff that we've built, moving that into prod without affecting anything that the other division already has in place.
And so you are on different sandboxes and you're on different boxes in development. Is that correct?
Correct.
Well, in that particular case, because there's going to be a possibility of a lot of conflict between each one of those fields that you've added. And remember, if you're doing a blueprint, you don't have an option to merge fields. You just have an option to overlay. So in that particular case, you would have to use a map to merge the fields to get into a single instance. And then once you're in that single instance, then you could build out the blueprint that would move everything that you need. Does that make sense?
I think so. So, for example, we have for all of our forms, and there won't be anything that'll be merged. We have all of our own separate forms. We have our own customer table. So we basically have all of our own tables, all of our own objects, quote unquote. So there wouldn't be anything that would be merged per se. Everything would be.
Well, what about incident?
So even an incident, so the incident we share, we don't really share anything in incident. We don't share any forms. We don't share any specifics forms. We don't we have all of our own forms and data, and the only thing that we've done is we've made sure to separate all of the data as far as the tables go by company.
But you still have a single incident object that with fields. I mean, you may have different views, but you still have a single incident object that is being used between the two, Komatsu America and Komatsu, and I'm sorry, I don't remember what the other one was.
Komatsu Mining.
Komatsu Mining and Komatsu America. You still have a same incident object. I mean, it might be different views, but it's still the same object.
Okay.
So in that particular case, because I could have added 4 new fields in my view, and the Komatsu America could have different fields if, and until they all got together in the same, because there's still only one underlying database. There could be different views on top of it, but there is still only one database. And to get those fields merged together, that's where the confusion comes in.
Okay.
So you still would have to probably do a map to merge everything together, and then you can actually then go through a blueprint process to build that stuff and move it to production.
Okay. Okay.
And if you need more, if you have more questions on that, I'd be happy to take that offline and talk to you about it.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's probably a good idea, because getting close to go live, we're kind of running around with our heads cut off right now, and we're really trying to figure out the best procedure for moving everything from dev to prod without breaking anything that's currently in prod, and that's been a harder task than we imagined it would be. So yeah, I would definitely be interested in talking more offline.
Certainly. Laura can set that up, and Laura can get together, as far as that goes.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
I'll connect the two of you. While we were addressing this question, a couple others came in. Should we address those now, Kim?
This is perfectly fine. Yes.
Okay, great. So this person had a question a few slides ago regarding blueprints. You said blueprints are automatically saved regardless if you save blueprints or not. It saves automatically on the Cherwell database. Does this apply to its rollback blueprint as well?
No. The rollback to my knowledge, the rollback blueprint does not get saved on the system. It would only be the blueprint that I'm applying. So the rollback does not get saved. Rollbacks are an interesting discussion all unto themselves. Rollbacks have a very, very limited scope, and by limited scope, I really mean kind of like immediate, and even that has to, have a couple little disclaimers against it. If I immediately apply something and it was some functionality and it didn't work properly, I could use that rollback blueprint to get reverse that functionality and go back to what I had. But there could be some changes, especially some database changes, that can't always be undone. As well as easily as you can move forward, it may not be that easy to move backward in time. So that should be a consideration when you're applying rollback blueprints. Also, let's say I have 5 blueprints I've worked on, because I've been taught to save everything. So I do blueprint 1, blueprint 2, blueprint 3, blueprint 4, blueprint 5. And I've now found a problem on blueprint 1. I can't go and apply the rollback for blueprint 1. I would have to go and apply the rollback for blueprint 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then, assuming that all those other caveats have been followed, then I would go ahead and have my system back. Does that make sense?
Looks like that answered his question. Yep. The other one I have is, if I'm applying a map, then take the final blueprint, make some adjustments, and publish the blueprint, then decide I don't like it, is there any danger for just publishing the rollback?
Can you repeat the first half of that question? Because I got the last half. I missed the first couple.
Sure. If I'm applying a map, then take the final blueprint, make some adjustments, publish the blueprint, decide I don't like it. Is there any danger for just publishing the rollback?
I would have to say it depends. And again, it depends on the various pieces that you're applying. I don't often work a lot with the rollback blueprints because I like having a lot of control over my system. I'm a little bit, rigid as far as like the way I like to control what I'm doing and know exactly what I'm doing. So a lot of times my preference would be, if I didn't like those things, I would more probably try to reverse it out, or I would always, and first of all, when you're applying a blueprint, or applying a map, you always want to take a backup of your system anyway before you do it. So my preference in that particular case would be to reapply the backup that I took before I started, or B, I would try to go in and delete those objects that were part of that map and kind of roll forward rather than roll back.
Hey, Kim, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. One thing I did want to note on that, I'm not sure if this is the case or not, but if you're making adjustments to fields and you remove a field and you intend to roll it back, any data that was in that field that you removed, even though the field will come back, the data will not come back. So just a point of clarification there about rollbacks. Data does not get rolled back.
And Tony makes an excellent point. Tony is another one of the Stratacom developers, and that is definitely one of those situations where a rollback won't help you. Laura, are there any other questions?
Looks like we're set to move forward.
Okay. Following through on best practices, I hope you're getting a theme for this presentation, because we're back to communication again. Communication between developers is the most important factor. Knowing your system, whether or not you're using a map or a blueprint or whatever, knowing the internal components of your system and reconciling them against the contents of your map is critically important, and also keeping your system up to date. Working with out-of-date systems can have things that just you think they should operate one way and they operate a different way, or they operate just fine and peachy in your development environment because your development environment has a whole bunch of other stuff that has cluttered it up and everything. And then when you move to production, something doesn't work, and it may be because you missed something. It may be because there was some other stuff that was in the system that is no longer in your production system. There could be any one of a number of many different reasons why, but that's why I am really careful about making sure that my systems are always up to date. If I have a major change for production that is like a checkpoint or a place, I will actually take a snapshot of that production environment after I move. I'll actually take a snapshot of my development environment too. I just actually did this week for another of my clients. And then I will take that production environment, I will overlay my development environment, and by taking that back above development, if I missed anything, I always have that development environment that I can reload and pick those items up. But then when I start my next development cycle, both of my environments, my development and my production environment, are all in sync together. And so keeping your system up to date, I think, is one of the key pieces. And as far as maps and blueprints, you want to use the option which best fits your circumstances. You want to, again, communicate and resynchronize those development environments often. So in conclusion, both maps and blueprints are very powerful when used correctly. The maps also can sometimes help you uncover items which might be missing, and I'm going to show you an example of that. In terms of maps and blueprints, absolutes do not apply. You can't say always use a map in this case or always use a blueprint. It all comes down to it depends. And so I'm going to just leave this screen here. And so here I am on one of my databases. I'm going to go ahead and create a new map. It's just like creating a new blueprint. You know, I create it and it opens up what looks to be almost exactly like a blueprint. There is an Add to Business Object Map wizard here, this button. Also down below, you can see this is where I was talking about on the individual business object level. There's View Publish Log. So if I click on Incident and I go to View Publish Log, I can see that right now there were no objects found, so this had never been changed. So, we're living in a different world, so I'm going to go ahead and add this business object to my map wizard. So when I do that, the first thing I'm asked is a next panel, and then I'm asked what kind of importance does this have in the map? To my knowledge, what you select here doesn't really have a huge bearing on what happens downstream in the wizard. So I generally keep medium unless I know that it's the primary focus. Like red, for example, the RED table is the most important table. So I will pick high importance for that. When you go to next, here's where it says, do you want to overwrite all fields when you're moving, or do you want to not overwrite all fields, or do you want to choose? So let's say I want to choose. So I don't want every one of these fields to be marked. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and say don't overwrite, and it'll unwrite all those things, and then I'll say let me choose. And then maybe I know that the field that I want is this field down here at the bottom, this workflow phase and withdrawal, because those are two new fields that I'm adding here that I want to wind up in my system downstream. And so do you want to overwrite all relationships, none, or let me choose? Well, especially in the case of where I have multiple development environments coming together at the same time, I generally don't want to overwrite all relationships. I would want to choose not overwriting any relationships unless I knew, for example, one relationship that I had updated that needed to change. Then I would say, let me choose. And then here you are with your default forms or your other items as well. And I'm not sure if all of your forms are listed here for all of your different views. It may be, but I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure about that. But you can always go get those forms. So maybe if I'm coming from those disparate work environments, I would say don't overwrite any forms, and then I would go to next. And then do I want to update any grids? No, I don't want to disturb the group that I'm coming in to marry up with. Do I want to overwrite the form arrangement? And by the way, this is speaking directly mostly about the default view. Well, and this would actually be all views, but I really probably don't want to do the form arrangement, especially if I'm going to be marrying different views together. And then overwriting approvals. Generally, I never overwrite approvals through a map unless it's something that I know that I'm moving and it's a part of a migration. And do I want to overwrite actions or not? Generally, I usually choose not to overwrite the actions as well. And so then you have a wizard completion, and you can go to finish. So here is my business object. If I go into my business object properties for my structure, there's one of my fields. You can notice it says overwrite. That means that if you've made changes to the workflow phase in your destination environment, and I will overwrite whatever changes that you have made with my changes. I can right-click on that field. I can go to the map action, and then here's where I can actually make those different changes. So I can make no changes. I can say, I want to only import this field if it's not already there. And so now you'll notice it says import if not found. And then the same is true down here. Then I can also come individually to that field as well. And I can say import if not already there. If I have multiple views for a business object, I have to make sure to include all my different views in my business, in my map, because if I miss some of those views, that could result in other functionality that doesn't work properly. So you'll, when I click here and go to the business object properties, you'll notice that the first thing I'm presented with, instead of being presented with a normal general tab like you are, above that is the map tab. And here you have some options as far as merging and importing functionality. I'm going to be very clear between this if already present and if this not present. I have found some issues with that where I've tried to set it so that it would do imports if not found. And even though it says import if not found over here, or like, you know, it doesn't. You'd actually have to right click on it and actually tell it to import if not found, because it'll be set to overwrite the field. It's kind of bizarre. That's just a little map quirk thing that I've found over time. And so, you know, you can have your default behavior for your fields and also your default behavior for the indexes as well. And then so into here, you can have advanced options. So you can, as far as the database is concerned, database attributes or the general attributes. So you can change some of those as well as whether or not to overwrite or not overwrite some of those options. So now I've applied something to my map, and I'm going to go back home here. So I'm going to let the map tell me kind of like what's missing. And the map will go to the nth degree to tell you what's missing. Now, in a simple, anybody who's applied incident to a blueprint and moved incident through a blueprint knows that a lot of times that's all you need is the incident business object. So let's see what the scan tells us. It won't take long, I promise. Are there any questions in the meantime?
There isn't anything currently in the queue.
This shouldn't take very much longer.
So one quick question did pop up. It says, so you select the BO you want to change upon creating the map?
I'm sorry, I selected which one I want to do? What?
I'm thinking it's business object. You select the business object you want to change upon creating the map?
Yes, yes. So I would add a business object to the map. Maybe my map doesn't do anything with business objects and it just does something with expressions and the one steps, and all of the other stuff is, the business object is exactly the same. Then I wouldn't have to add a business object. I could start with my one steps or my expressions or my stored values or my whatever I happen to have.
Okay.
And
another
of course,
question is,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say this time it didn't come up with anything. The last time it came up with a whole bunch of things. And maybe that was because I had said that I was overwriting everything, but it came up with a whole bunch of things that were in error. And I'm betting that was because I had picked like to overwrite a bunch of fields. But so it'll come up here and it'll tell you what's missing. And then you can actually click on the resolve map issues. And in this case, the only error that I came up with is the fact that it says that I needed to fill in all these details. And so I just give it a name, a description, and I click OK, and that error will go away. But if it detects anything that's missing, it'll show up in this list. You can actually do a resolve, and it will resolve any of those things that it finds. Resolving those things could actually result in new things. So if I'm doing that, I will resolve map issues, I will rescan, I will resolve, I will rescan, until such time as I come up with pretty much a clean slate. And that'll tell me, all those pieces that I probably should have in, at least by reference, in my blueprint, or in my map, excuse me. And what's the next question, Laura?
Can the font size be increased for those of us who have slight visual impairment?
Can't you do that on the webinar? I think there's a way to do that on GoToWebinar. I think that you can actually change the font size on there.
I'm not sure. If she's just wanting to see the webinar bigger, I would just hit Control+, and maybe that will make everything look bigger.
Let me see if, I don't know, Control. That doesn't do anything on my end. I would have to actually resize my screen at this point. I don't think I can at this point do.
I see a spot on my screen where I can, up at the top, I can zoom to 100%. I'm not sure if that's because I'm the organizer, but maybe look along the top.
I'm thinking window. That they probably have a smaller screen, and my screen is larger. So,
okay.
Let me see here. Work area screen, and it did go full screen. It's just on the other monitor. Just change monitor.
Okay, a bunch of people are chiming in saying there's a Zoom function for the webinar on their clients. So if you want to take a look, much like mine, it sounds like there may be a Zoom feature that you could find.
Is that a little bit better? You'll notice here that it is full screen now, at least. I mean, it may still be, the text may be small, but
she says it's perfect.
Perfect. Excellent. So a lot of times, like I said, if I'm going through, I will look at each one of the publish logs for the items that I'm working on. If I'm in a one step, for example, and I'm go to view details, I can see the last time certain things have changed. And I don't expect you to be able to read this, but they say 10/4/2017. So I know that the last time any one of these things changed was 2017. If I want to go through each one of these folders and look at things, I can also click on one-step actions, and I can go and click on asterisk, and it will go and search everything. And so then I can actually sort by, I can sort by last modified date. And so then I can determine when the last time things changed. And there was one item that changed on 11/24/2017. So that's how I can go and determine maybe certain things I want to add. And if I wanted to add that to my map or my blueprint, I can just, well, if I'm in this view, I have to actually edit it and go out. So if I click on edit and I just click OK, I'm not making any changes, I'm just editing it. And you'll notice that the date went away. So by the date being having gone away, it is included now in this particular blueprint or map. If I'm actually in a folder like here, I can right click on an item and I can say add to map or add to blueprint. So that's as far as building that map and then moving all of that information across. I'm going to just briefly walk through, like when you're applying a map, and it's taking a couple seconds here, pardon me. So you're first asked about language. This is on a 9.3 system. So how automatic should the merge process be? Ask me about everything, make most decisions, or don't ask me about anything. So if I say don't ask me about anything, it's literally not going to ask me about anything. It's going to assume that I don't have to make any decisions. And so it comes up with a summary and then comes up with finish. I have never seen an instance, like there is nothing about publishing directly. You still have to like open the blueprint. So I just always use the open a blueprint to create the blueprint to then publish. So it creates the blueprint. And I honestly don't know what we'll get here, but we'll scan. And sometimes maps react differently to different out-of-box systems, to different customized systems. So, when I say a map, I mean like a third-party map. So sometimes a map might need to be tweaked just a little bit, depending on what your environment is and what other things have been in your environment. And while this is scanning, Tony, do you have any other comments that you want to add in that I haven't covered?
Not at this time.
Okay.
I do have one question while we're waiting that came in.
Sure.
It says, our product owner and one of our developers couldn't attend but are going to watch the recording. It would be possible to have something set up offline. So if they have questions after doing so, yes, I will connect with you one-on-one. And if you have follow-on questions, we'll be happy to discuss those. So I'll make a note of that.
Certainly. And this takes variable time. Sometimes it scans really fast and sometimes not so fast. So in this particular case, it scans successful. Typically the red map will, if it's a newer system, will scan perfectly successful. If I go through, I'm not going to save this blueprint, but if I were to go through and apply that map and in a second here, it'll come up. Okay. And then ask about every decision. It literally will say, here, this is being changed. Do you want to change this, or what do you want to do with this? In a lot of cases, you can't actually make those decisions here. Sometimes you can. So here I can overwrite or not change. And then here's some configuration changes that could need to change. There's some change request things. So it's going to say, okay, here's incident. Do you want to merge it? Do you want to create a new object, or do you want to skip this object? There could be reasons why I would want to try to skip the object. So I could actually click on skip. This is one of those situations where I've run into where the company that I was trying to apply the map to had a similarly named business object. And even though we tried skipping, we tried creating a new business object, Cherwell was really trying to merge those two objects, even though they were not the same object. It was a risk assessment object, and so it was really problematic to try and do that through the map and include that object. So we wound up having to not include that object at all inside the map. But so you're asked various questions along the way. So do I want to include, by not including incident, that should hopefully create an issue. There's a red project table. Do I want to select a different object, create a new object, or skip? So I get to all those options. Every piece of the entire thing. And so you can see how it takes a lot longer to step through all those pieces. I just click next a lot. And then it goes through and opens the blueprint. And then if I go to scan, it's going to tell me some things are missing because I did not include that incident object, which had a key component, a field that's now missing. And in the meantime, while this is scanning, are there any other questions, Laura?
Nothing else has come in yet.
Bill, one of our other consultants, mentioned the fact that blueprints were only saved after 9.3.0. I think it's before 9.3.0, but he says they're definitely not saved in 9.0.1. So it's somewhere between, I think maybe 9.1 and above, because I'm pretty sure that and I'll show you how to get to those after we're done here. Are there any other questions in the meantime?
Not a question, but someone just popped in a comment. They mentioned they have version 9.2. Blueprints are saved in the database.
Yeah, and that's what I thought. But they're not in 9.0.1, but I think in 9.1 or 9.2 and above they are. Because I knew it was before 9.3. This should finish momentarily. And so here you can see that now I wound up getting some errors because I missed some things because I did not include the incident object. And if you ever have an item there, you can always, whether or not you have a blueprint or a map, you can click on the item that's in error and you can say go to error, and it will at least kind of like point you in the general direction of where your error is. In this particular case, it was a relationship. So that's just a handy little thing to know, that you can do that when you're looking at errors inside a blueprint or a map. Now, as far as the blueprints being saved, I'm going to close out of this blueprint now. And I'm going to go to the Blueprints tab category. And then under here, I'm going to go to the publish log. And there's a couple things. Number one, you'll notice that here it has a blueprint ID and it has a saved blueprint ID. So it actually allows me then to go and download that particular blueprint. And by the way, this one I haven't done a lot of publishes on, but if I had had a name on those, that name would actually appear there as well. So if it was like development changes or something like that, that name would actually have appeared there as well. The path, and then, oh, right there. So there's, no, that's portal default view. Sorry, there. So the blueprint name would appear in this column. The path to the blueprint that I had saved it on my local system would have appeared there. And then this is the blueprint ID and the saved blueprint ID. And I could just go and I could say download that blueprint and download it to my system if I needed to go and grab it for something. Are there any other questions?
I don't see other questions at this point. Is this the conclusion of your presentation?
This is the conclusion of my presentation. If anybody has some follow-on questions that they did not ask, please feel free to get in touch with Laura, and she can get you in touch with me. There's one just final thing I just want to, going back and reiterate that there is no just one magic bubble. Some people have kind of been lean toward maps, towards a mechanism for moving data, and some people have been leaned toward blueprints for moving your changes. You have to be open to using both of them, because in some cases a map might work better, in some cases a blueprint might work better, but you have to at least, know that you want to use the best thing for that particular thing that you're moving. And with experience, you'll know which to do. And that's it.
Okay. Well, this is a great point. If you do have questions on the presentation, enter them now before we move on. When all the questions are answered regarding this presentation, we're also going to move into some open forum discussions. So if you have questions for Kim or for other people on the line, start thinking about those, and please start entering those now as well. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions about this particular presentation. We'll leave the lines open for just a minute or two more as you're thinking of other questions you may have for Kim and the team. So if you have questions, enter now before we end the presentation. We will hopefully be having at least one more advanced practitioner call before the year end, so keep an eye out for that. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want the slide decks, you can put a note in the questions or chat panel. I'm happy to send those your way. We'll also be uploading the presentation to our website and sending the links out to everyone in our database, so you'll receive those in about a week or so as well. I'm not seeing any other questions, so we'll leave the line open for 30 more seconds. If you do have a question, now is the time to ask it before we conclude. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. So at this time, I'm going to assume there's no more questions. If you do think of something after the fact, feel free to reach out to me at any point. We're always happy to answer any questions you may have and start a conversation with your team. At this point, we'll go ahead and conclude. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Kim, for all the information. Hope to see everyone on the next call.
Thank you. You have a wonderful day.